Hey, did you know that in 2004, a man in a small Colorado mountain town spent 18 months secretly building an armored bulldozer inside his own shop? And then he used it to destroy half the town? And this wasn't some random act of chaos. Every single building he hit, it was on a list that he had been building for years. This wasn't a movie or a game. This was a real Tuesday afternoon in Granby, Colorado. And for 2 hours and 7 minutes, law enforcement could do absolutely nothing to stop it. This is the story of Marvin Heemeyer, the man who declared war on his town. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Hey Did You Know, where we dig up the weird, the forgotten, and the downright strange corners of America. I want to say thank you to everybody who has subscribed, watched the videos, everybody who's followed on Apple or Spotify. Thank you all for being here with us. I really appreciate your support. We are doing a lot better and a lot more successfully than I expected us to do. Like, again, I said many a time that this was just a small project that I started. So thank you everybody who was here with us and who has shared this podcast and just everybody that's enjoying. Thank you for all the comments that everybody's leaving. I really appreciate that. We're really building a community here, and I appreciate everyone for being a part of it. I do just want to say, as I always say in every video, make sure that you are liked wherever you're watching. Make sure you're following. But enough of me rambling on about this stuff. You guys want to hear the story, so let's get into it. Before we get into the rampage, let me give you a backstory on how we got to that point. Marvin Heemeyer was born in 1951, and by most accounts, he lived a pretty ordinary American life. He was born on a dairy farm in South Dakota, never married, and enjoyed taking snowmobile trips with his friends. He even led a rescue effort to help a friend who had become trapped under a small avalanche. His friends and family, they called him a likable person, someone who would bend over backwards for anyone. And during his time in the Air Force, he was stationed at Lowry Air Force Base in 1974, which is what brought him to Colorado to begin with. He ended up moving to Boulder, then found himself in Grand Lake, before purchasing 2 acres of land in Granby in 1992. So you're probably wondering, how did this man who would bend over backwards for anyone go from that to destroying half of the town? Well, it all started with a property dispute. When Heemeyer purchased that 2 acres of land, he didn't know it had a very basic sewage system. A sewage system in the form of a buried cement mixer, which had been left by the previous owners. And updating it would cost nearly double what he paid for the property. City officials told him that a septic tank would be a cheaper alternative, but he rejected that as well, calling the government's refusal to pay for a sewer line hookup, quote, extortion by government fiat. In 1993, he ended up opening up his muffler shop on the ground anyway, and that is when tensions began to build. In 1997, the original property owners, the Dochev family, announced their plans to expand their business and build a concrete batch plant nearby. They were buying up the surrounding land and hoping to sell off 23 parcels to small manufacturers. And that's when the town's planning commission told them that they needed to have a special permit. Of course. I mean, they also suggested that the Dochevs should try to purchase Heemeyer's plot to keep the plant away from the hotels and businesses along Route 40. So, the Dochevs approached Heemeyer with an offer. And upon hearing it, he wanted $250,000. But he then claimed that he had his lot reappraised and asked for an additional $125,000. So, the Dochevs managed to pull together $350,000. But by the time they had the money ready, Heemeyer had already had his property reappraised, allegedly, and now he wanted $450,000. But they weren't going to go for that, so of course the deal fell through. So, a petty and now angry, I guess, Heemeyer launched a public campaign against the concrete plant, and at first, it worked. Members of the public raised concerns about dust, noise, and environmental impact, but the Dochevs were ready for that. They addressed those concerns directly. They promised additional protective measures, presented detailed miniatures of the facility to concerned citizens, and slowly, the opposition faded. In November of 2000, Heemeyer filed a lawsuit to stop the project entirely. But by January of the next year, city officials almost unanimously approved the plant's construction. Heemeyer had lost, and I'm sure he wasn't too happy about that. Then the Dochevs actually tried to extend an olive branch to him. In June of 2001, Joe Dochev himself called Heemeyer personally. He made him an offer, dropped the lawsuit, and they provided him with a free easement to connect a sewer line to the new concrete plant at no cost. But Heemeyer's response was simply to hang up his phone. And around that same time, remember that cement mixer that he had spinning around underground? It finally filled up. And rather than finally installing a proper system, he began pumping raw sewage with a gasoline pump directly into the irrigation ditch behind his property. And he was later caught trying to illegally connect to a neighbor's sewer line. And at this point, it was the final straw for the sewer district. Officials stepped in and enforced a requirement that had technically been on the books for nearly 9 years, fining Heemeyer $2,500, which he paid the fine, but of course not quietly. On the memo line of the check, he wrote a single word: cowards. And from that point on, it stopped being a simple property dispute. Knowing the zoning decision was final and that there was nothing left to fight, Heemeyer made a decision. He traveled to California and purchased a Komatsu D355A bulldozer at an auction for $16,000. He had it shipped to Granby in July of 2002 and parked it outside of his shop with a for sale sign on it. It even tried to auction it off, but nobody wanted it. And to Marvin Heemeyer, that meant something. He later said in audio recordings that the bulldozer's failure to sell was a sign from God, a sign that the machine had a purpose.
I wasn't supposed to walk away from this because the Komatsu was still there. The built property was still there. If I would have gotten a bid of $450,000, I would have netted $5,000 more than I actually netted. Is that what it cost for you people to not pay? Because what I'm going to do is going to be worth way more than the $5,000.
So, in October 2002, he announced the closure of his muffler shop and put almost everything up for sale. And in October of 2003, a year later, he sold the property itself to a waste disposal company for $400,000, nearly 10 times what he actually paid for the property when he first bought it. He negotiated a lease to stay in half of the building he had just sold, telling the new owners that he needed to stick around until he finished some work. And something that I want to also add, something I thought was crazy when I was researching this story, within a single day of the sale closing, the new owners had already completed the water and sewer connections that Heemeyer had been fighting over for years. But, of course, at this point, Heemeyer wasn't thinking about the sewer anymore. He built a wall to section off his half of the building, changed the locks, and got to work. He even illegally constructed a small living quarters inside, so he never had to go home to Grand Lake, as he thought it was a waste of time. What he was building, he called the MK tank in his recordings.
My Marv's Komatsu, what did I call it? I got a name for it. Oh, my MK tank.
He fitted the bulldozer with thick composite armor plating covering the cabin, the engine, and parts of the tracks. For visibility, he mounted several video cameras on the outside of the machine, linked to 2 monitors on the dashboard inside the cockpit, all because once that armor was sealed up, there would be no windows. The cameras on the outside of the tank were fitted with 3-inch thick bulletproof polycarbonate, and he fitted compressed air nozzles inside them to blow away any dust so the lenses would remain clear. Inside the cabin, he mounted 3 rifles, including a .50 caliber BMG rifle, the kind of weapon designed to punch through light armored vehicles. It's safe to say, he wasn't planning for a quick joyride around town. On July 4th, 2004, at around 2:15 in the afternoon, the wall of the building exploded outward, and the MK tank rolled out. His first target was Mountain Park Concrete, the Dochev family's plant, the place where it all began. Cody Dochev was on site when his radio crackled with reports of an explosion. He looked up and saw an armored bulldozer bearing down on his family's business, and several employees scrambled to stop it, jamming objects into the threads, trying to lock up the machine. But of course, it's not going to work on a bulldozer. Cody, initially conceived that the thing must be operated by remote control, pulled out a pistol and fired at it. He then tried to climb on top of it, and even jumped into his own front end loader and drove straight at the bulldozer. But nothing was working. A sheriff's deputy arrived, followed by a Colorado State Patrol trooper, who was immediately fired upon by Heemeyer. More deputies poured in and opened fire, targeting the cameras on the outside of the machine, trying to blind him. But that 3-inch bulletproof polycarbonate held up. Then, Heemeyer turned the bulldozer and charged directly at the firing position occupied by several state troopers. They evacuated with seconds to spare. After destroying the concrete plant, the MK tank turned south and began rolling towards downtown at about 5 miles per hour. Officers at the plant, once he left, called for a reverse 911 notification to be sent to all residents, and then, Under Sheriff Glenn Traynor, he did something remarkable. He jumped on top of the bulldozer. While on top of the bulldozer, he rode it, in his words, quote, like a bronc buster trying to figure out a way to get a bullet inside the dragon. He even dropped a stun grenade down the bulldozer's exhaust pipe, which, of course, didn't work, and he eventually had to jump clear to avoid being hit by debris. It took Heemeyer about an hour to reach the heart of Granby, and when he got there, his next target was Town Hall, which had been hosting a children's story hour in his library right before the rampage had begun. Every child and adult inside were evacuated moments before Heemeyer reached the building and brought it down. From there, he turned towards Liberty Savings Bank, positioned his bulldozer so it was aimed directly at the corner office where a woman who served on the zoning board worked. And then, he moved on to the offices of the local newspaper. A scraper was brought in to try to block his path, but of course, he pushed that aside like it wasn't even there. Then, Heemeyer did something that shifted this property dispute rampage to something that could have been a mass casualty event. He began targeting a propane storage yard, firing 15 rounds into the tanks, some of which held 30,000 gallons of propane. Heemeyer then turned his guns on nearby power transformers, trying to find an angle that might ignite the tanks. Sheriff's Department later said that had those tanks ruptured and exploded, anyone within a half a mile could have been killed or seriously injured. But by this point, local authorities were running out of ideas. 200 rounds had been fired at this bulldozer, and not a single one had made a meaningful impact. Things got so desperate that then Governor Bill Owens allegedly considered bringing in the Colorado National Guard, either an Apache attack helicopter armed with anti-armor missiles, or a 2-man firing team equipped with a Javelin anti-tank missile. He ultimately decided against it because a missile strike in the middle of town would do a lot more damage than what Heemeyer was going to be able to do himself. Heemeyer's final target was Gamble's hardware store. He drove straight into it, but this time, something was different. While he was pushing through the building, one of the scrapers that had been following him was maneuvered into position on the sidewalk behind him, blocking his exit back onto the street. But Heemeyer was unaware of a small basement inside the property, and as the bulldozer moved forward through the building, the massive weight of the machine caused one of the treads to slip into the opening below. The tank was stuck, completely immobilized. SWAT teams swarmed the machine and officers surrounded on every side. And then, at 4:30 p.m., one of the SWAT members reported hearing a single gunshot. Marvin Heemeyer had shot himself in the head. And 2 hours and 15 minutes later, it was all over. 13 buildings damaged or destroyed and approximately $7 million in damage. And not one single other person had been killed. In the years since, Marvin Heemeyer became something of an internet folk hero. To a certain corner of online culture, he's the ultimate symbol of a little guy standing up to a corrupt system. Some people even mark June 4th as Killdozer Day, which I had never heard of until I redid this research. But of course, not everybody sees it that way. A former SWAT commander who led the response that day said, quote, his intent was certainly to maim and kill. And the reporter who spent years covering Heemeyer's disputes, and who also nearly lost his life when the Killdozer hit his newspaper office, has pushed back hard on the folk hero narrative. Now, Heemeyer definitely had some real grievances. Zoning disputes and local policies can genuinely grind a person down, and the system doesn't always treat people fairly. But, on the other hand, the Dochefs offered him a free sewer easement. The town gave him 9 years before enforcing a rule that everyone else had to follow, and he was even offered more money than he would originally ask for. In the end, Marvin Heemeyer was a man who felt the world had stopped listening to him. One of his most famous quotes was, quote, "I was always willing to be reasonable until I had to be unreasonable. Sometimes reasonable men must do unreasonable things." Today, Granby has been completely rebuilt. There's no physical trace of the rampage left in the town, and the dozer itself was later cut apart and scrapped to prevent souvenir taking. So, I want to ask you all this as I do every episode. Do you think Marvin Heemeyer was a folk hero for standing up to a broken system? Or do you think the Killdozer story gets a little romanticized in a way that ignores what really happened that day? Let me know in the comments what you think. And if you want to go deeper on this story, if you want to know more, a little bit more about it, there is a 2019 documentary called Tread, free on YouTube. And I will put the link down in the description so that you guys can go check it out if you'd like to. But for now, thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. And don't forget to follow because you're not going to want to miss the next one. Because next time, we're headed back to 1971 to a basement at Stanford University where a 2-week psychology experiment had to be shut down after just 6 days because the people running it had lost control of what they had created. The story of the Stanford prison experiment and what it revealed about what ordinary people are capable of. Until next time, thanks for listening.